Hello. Hi, welcome. I'm Devyani. Thank you so much for being here. It's amazing to see all of you here today. Welcome to this beautiful new theatre, new building. I believe, to use Katie's words, our wonderful comms administrator, this is the inaugural in this building. So it's more of an honor for me. Many of you went through the very professional new ticketing system. It made me feel like I should do something more entertaining than give you a lecture, but talking about language is always entertaining. It's exciting to speak in this building that's designed for cross-disciplinarity. So in my talk, I'll try to show how important adjacent disciplines were for the work that I do and my colleagues do, and to have this unifying space at a time when humanities are facing such challenges is quite exceptional. It's also just been nice to join when the building is new to everyone, not just me. Before I start, just a couple of comments and some thanks. Language and communication is always of interest to the wider public too, and two people have held this post before me and made enormous contributions in building that bridge. Professor Jean Aitchison was the first to hold this chair, and the second was Professor Deborah Cameron, who held it for nearly 20 years. More than anyone, Debbie showed us how a scholar can and should show the importance of language and communication in wider public discourse, and we miss her greatly. Pro Vice Chancellor, thank you so much for being here today. To others in the procession, one of the novelties of Oxford for me, I don't have a background at Oxford or Cambridge, is belonging to several different communities. So I've joined Worcester College, I've joined two faculties, and I'd like to first thank our provost at Worcester College, David Isaac, for making the unique experience of Oxford College life so enjoyable and so welcoming. My two faculty board chairs, Simon Horobin and Colin Phillips, thank you for being incredibly generous and supportive in these first months. It's made all the difference. And my post is very generously endowed by News UK. Thank you to guests from News Corps as well for making the time to be here. I definitely would not be here without you, so very many thanks indeed. I also want to say thank you to Katie, who I mentioned, and Dan Holloway, and the teams in English and LPP for so much help organizing this and assistance over quite a few weeks. So let's start thinking about how we talk to each other. A lot of people, when they visit Oxford or move to Oxford, talk about the beauty that they see around them. But for me, what I've been struck by is what I hear around me. I've moved from a place where the most famous accent is named after a cock's egg, supposedly Cockney, and a variety that was considered too uncouth for respectable writers to be associated with. And I'm moving to a place where the ambient accent was already described in the 18th century as the most legitimate. And in fact, this quote is equally negative. So you can see Lord Reith here, the first director of the BBC, a Scotsman himself, looking appalled because this is the moment where he says he's vehemently opposed to the use of what he calls the Oxford accent by BBC newsreaders and presenters because of the opposite reason. He felt it was too remote from the people. He specifically says he didn't want any accents that would be laughed at, and this applied for him to both ends of this range of social status. So for me, it's been an amazing move listening to voices around me, obviously very diverse voices in both areas. But we're going to set aside these questions of status till the end of the talk and start instead with the simplest social unit, which is the interactional dyad, so when two people are talking to each other. This little arrangement is at the center of all human activity. And because of how speech works, no two people speak exactly the same. And sometimes two people will have very different ways of speaking, but be communicating. So how much does that matter at the lowest and highest levels of our social lives? I'm going to be talking about using the word accent, but I'm talking about speaking styles, which can be a little bit broader than what we think of as accent. So I'm going to talk about this smallest scale, conversation, and then we'll move out in terms of social structure to community, and then end with a reflection on workplaces and how accent or speaking style plays out in all of these. So for each of these, I'll show you examples from projects that I've done. But I'm going to be looking at accent and also accent repertoire, the range that people have of how they speak across situations. I'll highlight a few contributions of the work, how we try and move our field forward. But I'll also mention along the way the influence of other disciplines. In some cases, that was very formative for me. And throughout, and especially towards the end, we also want to think about outcomes in the real world. So there are very theoretical questions we can ask about how we speak. But there's also the reality of whether there are consequences for speakers. So let's start with conversation. So I don't know how broad your accent ranges are, and I also don't know how much you drink. But you may have noticed for yourself or people you know that for some people, when they have a drink, their accent slips into something a bit more comfortable. And also when you're tired or angry. So I don't know if some of you recognize this, but it's an interesting phenomenon. It means that some ways of speaking require a little more attention and control than others. So it gives us some insight into the cognition of accents. But another interesting detail of this phenomenon of having a range and controlling it variably is the question of how far you can go with your accent. So George Osborne overdid the Mockney once on a factory floor, and he got a surprising amount of press across newspapers for it. Why so much press for doing a bad accent, in a public event? Some of it was, of course, political, but most likely people felt that it wasn't natural. And what I'm interested in to start with to talk about is how sensitive listeners are to what your baseline is of speaking. So you see this quite often in press coverage of how politicians talk, for example. But Obama is an interesting exception. A study showed that whereas most listeners in the US liked it when a politician was pronouncing their T's at the end of a word, they didn't like it so much when Obama did. And the reason was that his baseline is different. He doesn't pronounce those T's as much. So these are all people who don't know Obama, but they were so sensitive that they knew that he's too far from his baseline or his anchor. So these are two things to keep in mind, that we vary in our control of our range of ways of speaking, and that people have a limited tolerance for how far we can go. I became interested in this question, the boundary of speech control and what the social effects are of those tiny cues of whether you're comfortable speaking. So I looked closely at a journalist, Fareed Zakaria. I don't know if you know him. I should stress, I'm not particularly interested in Fareed Zakaria. It's just a case study to show some more general points. So he's interesting for his developmental profile. So he grew up in India, speaking some kind of Indian English, and now he's spent twice as long in the US speaking an Americanized kind of style of English. So let's first listen to his speech with an American audience. I've highlighted, not very systematically, it's just to draw your attention to some of the speech features that vary for him. So listen to this first clip.
because of his inability to forge truly deep and lasting coalitions, much of that work will not actually be consummated or completed.
And then around the same time with an Indian audience.
But as you know, they couldn't. I mean, there's also part of the problem in much of the world, even in South Asia, is people exaggerate the power of the United States.
So although he's hearably the same person and both extracts are mixed, hopefully you could hear the shift. And we call this audience design. It's quite well understood. All of us do it. I'm doing it right now because you are my audience. But what I found interesting was to look at what he's doing when he's speaking to just one person. So the addressee is not changing. And this is Charlie Rose, who's an American host and journalist. You can see he's fairly Americanized. That's his style for this kind of context. But he has these bursts of Indian English where it's going down. Don't worry about the details. He's getting more Indian style. And I was interested to listen to those little lapses in what he seemed to be aiming for. The thing to keep in mind is he did the same thing with Indian audiences. The average was lower, but he had these lapses, again, towards more Indian. If it's pure audience, you would expect the reverse kind of behavior of all these things. But one type of explanation, when I look closely at the context and what's happening, is that when he was under higher attentional load, if he's getting into an argument, parentheticals where you don't pay attention, speaking fast, and some lexical effects, he was shifting, which seemed very clearly comfort or ease, cognitive ease. He didn't have to pay as much or couldn't pay attention, so he was slipping into his first dialect. It's interesting because, remember, he spent twice as long in the US, but it also confirms something we know in linguistics, that your first learned dialect might be your dominant one even after a long time. But you see he has a quite high control of the American style. What interested me even more was that there were a few of these where it wasn't explained by pressure on attention, that he didn't have the resources to produce the style, the target style. It seemed more like he was doing certain stances in some of these dips to Indian English. And they tended to group under the category of switching off a polite style, an accommodated style, and just being himself. So when he was speaking frankly, when he was being skeptical about something, ridiculing something, being ironic. So being candid with Charlie Rose. What I suggest is that there's a relationship between these two. So the first one, is the cognitive ease is showing us that he's a bit more relaxed when he's a bit more Indian, even though he's been Americanized for so long. But the second is that he's exploiting that cognitive imbalance to show when he's being frank with you, when he's being himself, showing his real me. So for me, this was interesting because it goes against some of the things we say in sociolinguistics. And it doesn't undo the models I'll just show you. Those are clearly accurate for lots that goes on when we're talking to each other. But it shows that something else is at work as well. So one thing this goes slightly against is what we call audience design, where we might say somebody uses what we call an ethnolectal feature, a feature of their ethnic variety, and it marks ethnic identity. Often that is happening, but just because someone uses those forms, it's not always going to be ethnic identity. I have Indian features in my speech, and I'm not doing more Indian identity when I'm shifting. I'm actually trying to control my speech as well. So it adds to that perspective, and I'm always a little suspicious of too much identity in accounts of what we're doing, because we're also trying to persuade each other when we're talking to each other. We're trying to be credible. We're trying to have trust, these kinds of activities. And the raw material we have is our accent range. So more relaxed often is also an ethnolectal minority style. Another thing it goes slightly against, though it's part of, is theories of speech accommodation in linguistics. So we often have a shortcut way of thinking of speech accommodation, that if I want to have rapport with you, I'll converge more with you, and I diverge to show disaffiliation in some way. But if you think about it, we know there are limits to that. George Osborne found out the hard way, and many politicians have, and we all recognize that. If someone accommodates too much to you, it feels uncomfortable. There's something very fundamentally human that we have, that we want people to be roughly where we expect them to be. That's very different to wanting people to speak prestige accents. In fact, it goes in the other direction. So what I'm suggesting, just with the example of Zakaria, is that we, of course, do converge with each other and diverge from each other, but it's not a linear kind of effect. You can sound polite. I'm converging to you right now. But it can sound inauthentic if you go too far. But diverging also has positives, which is I show that I don't need to be polite to you. I know you so well that I can be myself. But if you go too far, you can seem disengaged. And it's quite political. So who is allowed to be so disengaged is actually quite related to social status. Some people don't have to make the effort. Some people do. But underlying this, there is an important addition to identity and social group accounts of interpersonal accent variation. We're not always signaling identity. We are sometimes using our effort and ease, knowing the listener has this amazing capacity to track it, to show candor, to show credibility, to show self. So the limits of tolerating accommodation, to me, in the end showed that we would be wrong to say everyone should speak, that the goal is to speak in a socially prestigious way. There's also very strong force where we want each other to seem like what we expect. And I think it's an important element in the long-term stability of accent differences. Otherwise, we would expect slightly different outcomes, moving away from highly stigmatized accents. Regardless of accent, you may have experienced this, regardless of a person's accent, we know when they're relaxed, and it means something often positive. So to change this way of thinking about how we talk to each other and what accent is doing in interaction, I was influenced by disciplines that are not at all my own. So one is in cognitive psychology. There's a very well-known model of having a default system and a more monitored and effortful system. It's exactly what I think is going on when we see people with an accent range doing the moves Zakaria was doing. And then also game theory is used to model all kinds of human behavior, but what we see in this kind of payoff and diminishing returns of shifts is really a part of that model. And it's nice when we're doing research if what we're seeing fits with a wider picture of how humans behave. It's also a situation where we never know full information about each other's intent. And so we're reading off the phonetic output, and that's also part of disciplines that are not at all part of linguistics. So it's been very productive. The Kahneman work completely changed how I think about style variation, actually. So let's keep in mind, hopefully this showed you that when we have accent variation, we're not always doing identity work. We're sometimes just talking to each other and trying to show our state of intimacy in the conversation. Keeping that in mind, let's move up one level and look at community, so a larger social structure. So we'll keep this idea of looking at repertoires in mind rather than just what someone's accent is, more how far they go with their speech, and look at a different project that I did some years earlier. I did a project in West London where I was interested in looking at competing predictions for how people acquire the accents they have over generations. So there's some tension between acquiring your peers' way of speaking, which all of us did to some extent. It's a very strong force. But in migration, we would then expect that we don't retain minority accent features that our parents have. But sometimes we see this long retention that we have in the South Asian communities, for instance, also Caribbean communities. In the UK. So I was interested in that balance of why some groups are retaining some features. But what I want to show you is a finding that I wasn't looking for, but that became very apparent in the community. So the one thing to keep in mind here is that this Southall community is a very old Asian community in the UK. So it means there are older and younger British Asians in the community. It's been around long enough that we have a generational difference among British-born members of the community. And they grew up in very different circumstances, mainly because of the demographic changes in the region. So just keep in mind the older-younger contrast. And we'll have a look again at speaking range, how people change how they speak by situation. So this is Anwar, an older, not that old, but we classify him as older man. And don't worry too much about that image. Where you see gray, he's using more Asian variants, Asian options for his pronunciation. And where you see white, he's using more British English pronunciations. But you can just listen to him. Again, I've just highlighted, not very systematically, just to help you focus on some sounds in his speech.
But then one time, my father, God rest his soul, he had a philosophy. He goes to me, "Yaar, one of these days, this food is going to become the UK's national dish." And look what happened.
Yeah. He runs a restaurant. But if you know Indians or are an Indian or a Pakistani, you could hear this and think he grew up in South Asia. He grew up in Ealing. But now you can hear him speaking to somebody about a broken windscreen.
The difficult two pieces, we've bought them already, we've got them. But the main screen is something that is not just off the shelf. It has to be made, and because I was told by National Windscreen that you guys cut your own and make your own screens, it's something that you'd be able to assist us with.
So again, he's hearably the same person. He has a mixed accent, but could you hear that he's shifted his style? So he has a very broad range of styles. He also has a mixed kind of mixed London style with some of his friends that I'm not playing you. But now listen to this younger woman. She sounded like this in the interview.
I wanted to go into media. I wanted to go into acting.
In sociolinguistics, we rely on interview data a lot. And if we had only looked at interview data, she would have confirmed one type of generalization in our field, which is that women gravitate toward the standard style of speaking more. We do find that in quite a few studies. But it's also been stated very strongly as a kind of essential feature of being a woman, that you'll always, some kind of psychological preference. She is doing that in interview. She sounds very standard. But we recorded her at home, and she sounds like this.
But then I didn't have time. It's like hotels and everything.
So she's not completely shifted. Actually, she doesn't completely shift like Anwar does. She's not bi-dialectal completely. He is. But she has a complete switching off of her Asian features for a number of life worlds, contexts that she leads her life in. So that's a difference. But what's interesting is it's an older man and a younger woman, Anwar and Namrita. And what we found, and this is just examples of 4 people, but we aim to, it's very hard to get this kind of data. You can see it's uneven. But we aim to get a few of each category to show it's not idiosyncratic. But it was very clear that, and there were exceptions that supported the rule in a way, but we found that older women and younger men had a fused way of speaking. So they didn't do the switching on and off. They just tended to have the same mix in different speaking situations. Ultimately, what I found, looking at the content of their interviews, what are their lives like, how did they grow up, what it seems to be the case, especially by measuring how diverse their networks are. So how many different mini worlds do they spend their time in? How balanced are those in terms of numbers of people they know? It's the older men and the younger women that have very broad networks, and the older women and younger men not. If we think about the older generation, what's actually happening is that they are the first born, local-born generation of South Asian parents, Pakistani and Indian. The men started getting involved in local politics. This is in the 80s, 70s, 80s. There was open hostility, racial violence. Many of them said we couldn't possibly do identity work, let me sound a bit Asian in school because we were being beaten up. We had to be able to sound like lower middle class or working class white peers did for survival. But they were also going into their father's businesses, traveling to Pakistan or India and developing that. So a huge life range. But the women weren't doing that. So the women were getting married younger, having kids, working in local factories. What was actually happening was that first generation was maintaining the traditional Punjabi social roles, where the women are a little bit more inside the community and the men are at the interface of the community. And by the younger generation, that's reversed. And we know from work, for example, Leslie Milroy's work in Belfast, that the gender pattern in British communities for working class, lower middle class groups is that the women are more at the interface. They work in department stores and they work in, so blue collar work for women is very different to blue collar work for men. So the men are more in the community, the women are at the edges. And that's what we're seeing for the younger generation. So what accent repertoire actually shows us here is that there was a one generation lag in social structure, that even though everyone's born in West London, the first generation in terms of social behavior, social roles, is still like their Punjabi, this is mainly Punjabi community, parents' generation, first phase of the community, and by the second, it's shifted. For me, also, when we started this work, there was some negative political talk in public discourse about non-integration of immigrants, and which is very, very inaccurate for London communities. If you know them, they're very, very rich linguistically, very high interaction across groups. But this showed in both generations showed a kind of engagement with the British culture around, and the accent range shows us a very systematic sociological thing that happens. From the outside, people would just hear a little bit of an Asian accent and think these are people who are not, not like us. But in fact, they are super British in their gender roles at this point. So we've looked at community, and here we've again used accent repertoire, like we looked at Zakaria's speech. What is he doing in real time across situations? But it showed us something different. It showed us not that women are essentially one way or another, but actually that your social network drives your repertoire type. And that is driven by gender roles that are depending on when you were born, actually, what generation you were born into. Looking beyond the interview and looking at range helped us support. There's been a lot of critique. This is by no means new. Critique of essentialist accounts that women will always do something. And I think of Debbie Cameron again here, who said it better than anyone, that we have to look at the context that a woman is speaking in, and this is a very vivid example where it actually completely reverses because of social change. Also, looking at speech like this shows us quite a fundamental sociological change that isn't very easy to see, but was actually quite systematic in kind of, I don't want to say anglification, but integration of social structure over time in the community. Again, interdisciplinarity is nice to note here. In sociolinguistics, we use certain network measures, but they weren't really the ones I needed. I could see, talking to these people, some of them were saying, oh, I can't even tell you, when I was doing a network survey with them, can't even tell you how many people I interact with. And then some were saying, 2. So I thought I need the right measure for that. It seems to be related to what they develop over childhood and young adulthood. So I found a different measure that's used for things like species diversity and things like that. So we're going to start talking more about life outcomes with the third theme, where we're going to switch to workplaces. But even here, there's just a couple of things to note that are a little consequential for this community. At one point, there was a very short piece about this work in the Times, and I wondered, I care about this, but does anyone else? So I was a bit conscious that they wrote about it. And the next day I got an email from someone who teaches business in North London. And he said, I was interested to see this. It's exactly what I experience in my classroom. The young men who come to my class from these communities have more difficulty developing the business style I want them to use, and the young women almost already have it. And so it was interesting to hear that out there were these consequences. As linguists, we don't say, well, then you should stop being different. We actually say, well, there are consequences, but it doesn't mean that we, that we judge the history of the community. But it's interesting to see those. And then in a current project that I'm not talking about today, we are now tracking primary school kids, recording them as they go through school every 6 months to see how their repertoires develop. I just found them very gendered in adulthood. And I wanted to know how do people get classed and gendered in these ways while they're growing up? How early do young kids start developing that repertoire or not? So we are looking at how it emerges. So we can move to another third type of space where accent plays out, and then really look more at life outcomes, which is the workplace and organizations. So this is, I'm going to share a few, we're back to the Cockney and the Oxford man, but I'll share a few observations from a project that a team of us did. About accent, specifically in workplaces, so more applied kind of work. The UK has organized its society around accent for centuries. It's the most sophisticated, one of the very sophisticated accent-based cultures that we know, certainly in the English world. But there's actually more work on workplace consequences of accent in the US, partly because the work is done in management studies programs, looking more at non-native accents. And so we wanted to look for an updated picture for the UK. There have been attitude studies, and we wanted to update those. But we also wanted to look at reactions to voices, which had been done a little bit less. And we wanted to look at consequences for access to elite professions. So George Bernard Shaw, he gave us the hypothesis, and our project was to test it, basically. And a little less eloquently, we were also motivated by a Social Mobility Commission report that came out shortly before we decided to do this, that was about covert barriers to access to elite professions. They were looking at law and finance. They didn't look at accent. It was a qualitative study. But they were interested in what these notions of cultural fit or polish actually are in hiring. Could there be a risk that people recruit in their own image, what we call affinity bias? And ultimately, is there a risk that what we think sounds professional is actually sounding middle class or upper middle class, so that there's a risk of a kind of blending of these? So we felt that accent possibly played a big part in this. It hadn't been looked at. So we wanted to know what part accent plays. And So yeah, we did a very different kind of set of studies to that, but were inspired by that. Before I show you some of what we looked at, there are a few things to keep in mind when we talk about accent bias. We don't want it to seem like a simplistic finger-pointing exercise, nor do we assume that it's present. So first of all, we all have an accent. Sometimes people say, I don't have an accent, but for linguists, everyone has an accent. We also all have bias. That's how our brains work. We all react to accents based on what we've been exposed to. So what we're interested in is whether those preferences, or whether it's exposure or prejudice, those preferences, whether they translate into discrimination in the sense of evaluating someone's skills or competence based on those stereotypes. We're not really looking at completely eliminating biases that we have towards everything, which you really can't. So the last point to keep in mind is that we always say when I'm working with outside organizations, this isn't a new form of bias. So sometimes people start to look tired. They say, oh, we have to have another EDI training session. But it's not another bias. It's a route for discrimination against protected characteristics that we already talk about. It's a route for discrimination against gender or race, against sexuality, age. So it's more that this is the mechanism, and people are not always attuned to that. So we did a number of large nationwide studies looking at listeners' reactions, and we worked with law firms on smaller studies with lawyers. We also worked with lawyers to develop the mock job interview recordings that we were playing in these studies. And then we also looked at speaker testimonials to see the speaker perspective. I'm not going to go over all of that. I'll just pick out a couple of studies, sub-studies that we did. But I'll just give you first an overview of the main findings that we, the main conclusions from the main questions. So we first wanted to just see where attitudes in the UK are. It's not that interesting in the sense that it was just ranking accents, and we found that people still rank accents in pretty much exactly the same order from surveys 15 years ago and 50 years ago. But that just tells us that they know their society. It doesn't tell us about their personal attitudes. We did see young people showing less bias, but there's some evidence in our data that we change with age, we get more judgy. So if you see young people, that's because they're in their teenage, revolutionary phase. And when they become employers and line managers, some of that, goes back down. So it's a mix. There's also a lot of change. But we didn't want to assume that these are affecting, especially our focus was on job interviews and hiring. It's not right to assume these effects because actually, as we found, people may be able to override them. So we found, in fact, I won't give you all the details, that acting on these biases was quite reduced when more was at stake. So when people are listening to a job interview and when they're hearing the real voice of the speaker. Lawyers were great. We did a much harder task with them, not just, does this job candidate seem competent for a trainee law position, but they had to do something harder. And they didn't act on any of the biases we saw in the larger nationwide studies. It's completely unlikely that they don't have the same biases that we see in the general population. It's just they can be shallow in terms of whether or not you act on them. But interestingly, the law firms we worked with, when they saw that, they said that's not the whole picture. There are definitely lawyers acting on these biases in general in the workplace, but it was good to see that they could easily do hiring tasks without, I'll come back to that type of positive. Fundamentally, what our studies checked was, is an underrepresented accent heard as less qualified for a law trainee law position, even if the candidate gives exactly the same answer. And we do complex designs, so you're not listening side by side to the same answer, but you get 1,000 people and you can draw some conclusions. We did a close study of 5 accents for this: North and South, working class and middle class, and black and white working class accents in London. And the 2 London accents were rated lower for competence despite giving exactly the same answer. So we narrow down to an accent effect like that. In order, if we're working with workplaces, we need a little evidence to say there's something to pay attention to. But I'll come back to what else we say when we work with them, because the picture was quite mixed. There's some bias, but also some positives. So I'll show you just briefly a couple of details from this project that go a little beyond those general takeaways. The first is a sub-study that we did where we wanted to look at how much it matters how strong your accent is. You might have been thinking about that when I say workplace. Actually, that's something people worry about when they have an underrepresented accent and they notice. So in a small study, we looked at multicultural London English speakers. So this is a new dialect you might have heard all around London, also beyond London. That's a working class variety that's used across ethnicities, but strongly associated with Black and Asian speakers. You hear it in advertising a lot now. It has quite a wide range, actually. I heard 2 young men upstairs outside my office speaking MLE, students doing their work. So we looked at speakers. Again, this is a job interview kind of situation where the rating is for how good they would be for a job. I'm sorry to be brief, but I'm not showing you what people are hearing, but they're about half a minute answers to questions in an interview for a trainee position. You see an effect where the mild accent is preferred for both. So for Northern, we're looking at a working class Leeds accent versus a less regionally specific middle class Northern accent, and for MLE, milder and stronger. But the Northern difference was not significant, but the MLE difference was. It's an interesting effect because it's actually a little hard to interpret. It could be these are the only speakers who were Black out of 10 recordings that we're playing people, 10 speakers. But it can also be because it's the newest working class accent, and humans hate new ways of speaking, and parents also hate new ways of speaking. So it could be that effect, it could be combined. So either way, the intersectional effect here is that these are both underrepresented accents, but accentedness is being judged more for one of them, either because of newness or ethnic bias. So an interesting detail here is you might have thought, well, multicultural London English is known to be the more stigmatized out of the ones we looked at, 2 Northern and 3 RP, received pronunciation, Estuary, white Cockney end of Estuary, and MLE. So you might have thought because it's the ethnic minority accent, the most stigmatized, it will be rated lowest in all of our studies. But the mild accented person is one of the highest rated. He's often rated higher than RP speakers. So that is actually change. That is people saying, that's nice, I'm glad to hear. So a different voice sounds competent, do the job. That, I think, is real change from if we had done these experiments 20 years ago. But we also see the strong accented speaker always rated lowest in all the studies that we do with these recordings. So there's a kind of, again, limit of tolerance of a different kind, where there might, maybe you could think of it as a penalty for not modifying, not accommodating. So here we see a little bit of interaction of social traits. Another unrelated, but for us that was very interesting, led by my colleague Erez Levon. We looked at how people are reacting while listening to a job candidate giving their answer. And this is very simplified for today. But what we found, so this is again a received pronunciation job candidate giving an answer and an MLE speaker. The answer is identical, not listened to side by side, but pooled data in a big study. Listeners actually heard different speakers and different questions all mixed up. After 3 seconds, we see, we see a significant split. 3 seconds is enough to know what accent you're hearing, but you don't know the content yet. So it suggests that a pure accent split happens where RP gets a little boost. But then you see that MLE comes up towards the end. This is the finding for a job interview response where there was expertise required in the response. So it was about technical legal information. So what we see is that there's an initial dispreference for MLE, but it interacts with the content they're hearing. In fact, with non-expert questions, that doesn't mean that they didn't know expertise. It was things like, why did you become a lawyer? So generic questions. For older listeners, the blue MLE line doesn't come up. So it's the expert content that caused it to go up, but you can see the risk for an MLE speaker if people are listening like this. They better not mess up in their interview. In terms of theory of how attitudes work, for us this was interesting because we often talk in linguistics about attitudes as categorization. So we hear something and we say, oh, that's a woman, or this is an Asian speaker, and we activate our stereotypes about that group. It's quite static. But here, we would say attitudes are live. They're actually more going back to what I mentioned about Bayesian inference under uncertainty. They're actually, you're not sure. You're bringing your stereotypes in, you're bringing the content you're hearing in, and you're constantly making a guess. Could this be a lawyer? Could this be someone, who I'm going to rate positively? So it's showed us a different way to think about how attitudes get activated in our minds. So different kind of bias, but still there. But on the positive side, are there times when accent doesn't matter? So while we were doing this work, I started to feel uncomfortable because as linguists, we look at the language and then we go out and tell people, there's bias against accent. We should, focus on it. It's a problem. But because we were working with lawyers, I knew they were saying accent is an issue, although it's much less of an issue. But they also talked a lot about confidence and they talked about knowledge. And that these are also very important in interviews. And I've started to feel it was a bit disingenuous for linguists to just focus on the accent effects. Maybe they're not the biggest effects. And I always think of the speaker, a student who's an MLE speaker going for a job. Is it really going to be great to say there are terrible accent biases against you? Or should we actually show how bad that is? And actually we looked, I did a small sub-study where we used the same recordings but added hesitation and disfluency, made them sound less confident, and it was a much stronger effect than accent. And then I showed you the expert effects, not in detail, but all accents get rated higher with expert content. It supports something we know from psychology, which is that humans are lazy listeners. So if we don't have something to target our attention on, hang our focus on, we will fall back on stereotypes. It's what's available. So what's happening here is that speakers are giving the listener something else to focus on, and the reliance on stereotypes is going down. But it's a double standard, right? So if you face bias, you better be confident, and you better know your stuff. So it doesn't mean it's fine, but it is comforting to students that we talk to. So interestingly, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, I have. People mumble when they are self-conscious about their speech. And so when we do outreach work, we say, here's some evidence that you should do the opposite. Just forget your accent and show your confidence and knowledge, and it'll have the effect you want rather than sounding underconfident. So in the few minutes that remain, I want to move from those three examples of research on accent and accent range at different levels, and just talk about what I started talking about just now, which is engagement with employers, engagement with organizations about this work. So this screenshot is from an e-learning module that we share with employers to go over some of our findings. I should say, as I mentioned earlier, I always tell employers who are interested in this, we are not trying to increase the time that you spend doing unconscious bias training. In fact, I'll show you how we show that it's not needed. We're just trying to get people to realize they use accent in this way. And also, I always say that we have mixed findings. So we're not just giving our opinions, we're showing a lot of types of evidence of positives and negatives. So the first thing we wanted to make sure we do is not go into workplaces and say, you should do an intervention if they don't work. And actually, psychology and management studies have started to show that gender and race unconscious bias training doesn't always work now. And it's possibly because the message is saturated. Sometimes recruiters will even behave worse after training. So there's some problems. But interestingly, we tried 5 different interventions to see, does it affect, so we don't want recruiters to start up-rating the underrepresented accents. We want accent differences in rating to disappear. Maybe there's a bad response in MLE and they should notice that. So we tried a number, and the simplest one showed a significant reduction of accent-based judgments. And that was just, you don't have to read this in detail, but it just says sometimes people rely on standard accents to infer competence. Try not to do that. The reason we think it worked is that even though there's a lot more awareness of accent diversity, there's hugely more accent diversity around, which is half of the battle won. I don't think people stop to think about how much they use accent as a cue, because there's such rich detail in our voices. So I think what was happening was people were just stopping and realizing, oh, I think I do that. So that's why we say it's not very time-consuming, and you will slightly reduce social class bias, which is almost entirely carried by through voice, with a little awareness raising. As we know, this kind of awareness raising doesn't eliminate the underlying biases, it just makes you aware of them. Also, code switching is very common. We saw spectacular switchers earlier. Many of you do it, that's fine. But to have a norm that people should do that in the workplace, as you can imagine, keeps the voice very narrow, that association of professionalism with middle-class voice. And also, it is actually cognitive pressure. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I've talked to people working in professional roles where they say it actually is tiring. I don't always want to be doing that performance. So that's also slightly problematic. And really, the elimination comes through increased diversity, as we see with gender, for example. 50 years ago, people would be surprised and react with biased responses to see a woman in a university in different roles, and we see how different that is now. So we give this mixed message when we work with partners. I wanted to share these 2 interesting, I'll finish very soon, these 2 interesting takes on the same situation. So Hashi Mohammed is a lawyer. He was a Somali refugee, very disadvantaged background, grew up in London. He got a degree at Oxford. He's very prominent now. I've never agreed so much with someone that I disagree with, because everything he describes, I won't read through it, is correct. This is the situation. There are constraints for some speakers, but his conclusion, which I also have a lot of sympathy for, but I've just described why it's problematic, is to be pragmatic and conform to the norm. So he always says, don't be an accent martyr. You won't get the outcomes you need, and you're doing this long-term work that won't happen in the short term. And I respect that he says that. It's not what I suggest to workplaces for the reasons I just listed. places pressure, it homogenizes the voice in workplaces, it excludes the best and the brightest sometimes. But it's interesting to see his view. On the other hand, you can hear Michael Caine, a famous Cockney, talking about his own accent.
I never got rid of my accent. I could have gone to voice lessons, but what I wanted to do was, as I thought, if I have any use, acting is not such a useful profession, compared with doctors or anything. And I thought if I have any use, I could fight the class system in England. So I kept my accent, and I always thrust my background down everyone's throat in order to encourage other people who came from the same background as me. Because like my parents and people that I grew up with, when I said I wanted to be an actor, they said, well, who the hell do you think you are? And it's above your station because you don't speak properly.
Your
so I said, the hell were you?
Two takes on the same problem. I have been very, very surprised positively by the level of interest in the work that we do across sectors of work. And I have very different experiences talking. So for instance, when I meet NHS trust groups, there is a lot of accent bias in the NHS. There are a lot of African and Asian workers who, we are talking about access to elite professions here, but very different experiences to some of the others. But I don't think the interest is superficial and that they have targets. I think they have more diverse workplaces now, and so they are engaging with it, which has been great. But I wanted to just say a word about engaging with the media. Media have also been interested. So this FT article has almost 500 comments, and they're not all negative. So there are stereotypes of academics, but we have stereotypes of professionals. And I thought with this work that corporate lawyers, bankers would just say, get away with your nonsense. we don't want to think about, but it's quite the opposite. So a lot of workplaces want to go further, and we give this kind of balanced view, which is things are changing quite fast already. It's just a bit of awareness. But that's positive. But with journalists, initially, I encountered another type of bias. There's some journalists here, which is called bad news bias, which is that newspapers like to report bad news. I don't know what that is about humans. They like to read it, and journalists like to print it. And I found that journalists, in a very well-meaning way, would talk to me and then only report the bad news. I did a very long interview once, and then the BBC program ended with, but what can we do about it? And I felt like a third of what we talked about was actually the quite simple things to make people aware, and also confidence. So when Pilita Clark got in touch, I said, I won't do this if you don't cover all the different things, because you have to think of the people who speak these accents. You can't just leave out the good news, which is, it's weakened, and confidence is much more of an effect, and that that lawyers very easily set it aside after being reminded. So now I feel like it's been an interesting experience with journalists, because I think that from their point of view, they feel that they've done some kind of social action by saying, look, there's all this accent bias. But overstating it is a real disservice to the speakers. It's not what we found. And then a final detail. So we worked with Amol Rajan on a documentary, and they asked us for these numbers for their documentary. So you can see that RP, it's not the majority accent for British people. We know that. It's still, for newsreaders on the 4 main channels, still overwhelmingly the preferred accent. Again, we have to be realists. Nobody is expecting a fully nationally representative media, but in the UK, there's quite a distance. But I did want to show you that we looked at MPs over 30 years, but in 2019, notice how the minority ethnic MPs use slightly more RP. And I think it takes us back to intersectional effects, where if you're from Bolton and you're also black, you're going to be navigating quite a number of potential biases. And so they're being pragmatic in a way. So it's an interesting difference, intersectional difference. So I have one slide after this. Just to summarize the studies we've looked at, I've tried to show you how accent and speech repertoire matters beyond, I don't want to say just identity, but it's not really what I've been focusing on. The first use was calibrating candor, showing someone that you're being candid with them. The second was how it tells us about social order in a way that we can't see easily. And then maybe the dark side a little bit is that it moderates life outcomes, but even that is changing quite fast. But a final slide, because it's become customary to pay our respects to AI in every talk and every meeting. But for linguists, it's been a revolution in our field. Whether we're skeptics or embracers, all linguists are rethinking the phenomena they work on to some extent, maybe not all. But AI actually relates to all of the things I've just talked to you about. So we're all living these slightly more hybrid lives. We're speaking through computers, to computers. AI interviewing has been coming in as a fix for the issues that we just talked about. It's affecting how we talk to each other in workplaces and more casually. But I wanted to mention consequences of that. Both in terms of speaking and listening, the two things we've been talking about, there are some risks. So recently there's been work that shows that because automatic speech recognition tends to fail more with underrepresented varieties, we simplify when we're talking to machines, or we type. So we take out the richness of our speech talking through machines. But a number of psycholinguists have shown how important talking is for memory development, attention, for lexical retrieval. So we start to lose it's like a gym for your brain, and we lose it when we start to homogenize because we're accommodating to machines. And the same on the listening side. So you might have heard that your train announcements, and when you're on hold for 50 minutes, the voice has become more natural. It's not Bond Street next station, but it sounds like a person speaking, which used to be called concatenative text-to-speech, and now it's neural. So it sounds like a person, right, when we hear these announcements. But apparently, it's achieved through acoustic blurring a little bit. So again, blurring out the fine differences to make it sound natural. And again, there's earlier linguistic work that shows that how good we are at hearing each other depends on how wide our networks were when we were growing up. So we got the training of listening to different voices, and we can process speech differently. So in both cases, the effect of working through machines might be reducing our cognitive benefits that we get from diversity of voices. So keep talking to each other in varied ways. It's good for your brain. Thank you. I wanted to say thank you to all of you for coming today. I also want to say thank you because almost all the work today, except Zakaria, which was just me and him alone in a room, has been collaborative. And my wonderful PhD supervisor, John Rickford, talks about academic kinship. So my PhD student came back from a conference once saying, John introduced me to everyone as his academic granddaughter. I pay my respects to my parents. I don't know if Ben Rampton is my uncle or older brother, but I won't work it out. But these are just some of the wonderful family of research that makes it all worthwhile. Thanks.